Two white cops threw a female farmer behind bars, laughing and humiliating her. But they didn't know who would come for her in 5 minutes. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning sun rose slowly over the fields, washing them in a soft gold that promised another day of heat and labor. Lorraine Harper stood at the edge of her porch with a cup of black coffee warming her hands, watching the mist lift from the rows of corn that stretched as far as her eyes could see. She was 45 years old, her dark skin etched with the quiet resilience of someone who had worked the land long enough to know its moods and tempers. Her body was strong, her palms rough with calluses, her shoulders wide from years of lifting, pushing, dragging, and carrying. She had no one to share the coffee with, no partner leaning against the railing beside her, no gentle voice greeting her with the promise of a kinder day. That kind of companionship had been buried with her husband years ago. Since then, her only partners had been the soil, the seasons, and the animals that depended on her steadiness. The farm was more than land. It was memory, inheritance, and duty. It had belonged to her father before her, and before him, to a grandfather who had worked it through droughts, storms, and the cruelest winds of prejudice. Lorraine had inherited not just the house and fields, but the weight of expectation, to keep alive what those before her had fought to hold. It was not the best land in the county, but it was theirs. The clapboard house stood weathered yet firm. The red barn leaned slightly to the left but still held hay and tools, and the pasture was dotted with the shapes of cows grazing lazily. Each day followed a rhythm. Lorraine rose before dawn, fed the animals, checked the fences, walked the fields to see if pests or blight had begun their work, and returned to the house for a brief breakfast before throwing herself into the heavy labor. Tractors needed maintenance, seeds needed to be sown, weeds cut back, and water rationed carefully. Every day her body was tested, but every night when she sank into bed, she felt a satisfaction no office or factory job could ever give. The land took, yes, but it gave back to those who treated it with patience and endurance. Despite her quiet devotion, she was never truly accepted in the county. Neighbors looked at her with suspicion, some with open disdain. In a place where farming was often associated with families of a certain color and lineage, Lorraine's very existence as a black woman holding her ground unsettled many. Whispers followed her when she drove into town with crates of produce. At the market, her corn and wheat were weighed with colder eyes and offered lower prices than those of her white counterparts. When she asked why, the answers were vague. Not the right quality. Buyers prefer other suppliers. Times are tough. Yet she knew it was not the crops that were being undervalued, but her presence. Banks, too, circled her like vultures. Loan officers hinted that perhaps the farm would be better managed by others, offering her buyouts far below what the land was worth. They spoke politely, their words wrapped in courtesy, but the undertone was always the same. This farm should not remain in her hands. Lorraine listened without anger, nodding, sipping her coffee, and then returning to the fields. Their voices did not break her. If anything, they reminded her that her existence on this soil was an act of defiance, each harvest a declaration that she would not be moved. But beneath her calm surface lay memories that few knew about. Before she returned to the farm, before her husband's death left her tethered to the earth again, Lorraine had served in the United States Army. She had not been an officer with medals pinned on her chest for ceremony, but she had carried responsibility. She worked logistics, commanding convoys that threaded through dangerous territories and deserts where the air shimmered with heat and fear. She had led men and women through roads littered with uncertainty, and she had buried comrades whose lives ended in fire and dust. War had shaped her patience, had carved into her the knowledge that silence could be a weapon, and that calm could break enemies faster than fury. It was that discipline she carried into her life as a farmer. When drought came and neighbors despaired, she remembered nights in foreign lands where water was scarcer still. When machines broke down and repairs seemed impossible, she thought of the convoys stalled in sandstorms, the way they patched engines under gunfire. Her life on the farm was not easier, but it was familiar. She endured it with the same steel that had carried her through war. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, Lorraine loaded sacks of grain into her old pickup. The boards creaked under the weight, but she secured each rope with practiced hands. She needed to deliver them to a buyer 2 towns over, someone who had finally agreed to a fair price. She wore a faded denim shirt, olive green pants, and boots caked with soil. Her hair was tied back, her brow glistening with sweat. She climbed into the cab and started the engine, her mind already on the dinner she would prepare when she returned. The road stretched empty ahead of her, lined with whispering cornfields and the distant hum of cicadas. She drove steadily, humming softly to herself, until flashing lights appeared in the rearview mirror. At first she thought it was just another patrol, but the car stayed close, its siren blaring until she pulled to the shoulder. 2 white officers stepped out. One was tall and broad, with a face set in hard lines that seemed carved to intimidate. The other was shorter, leaner, with a smirk that never left his mouth. They moved with the arrogance of men who believed the road belonged to them. Lorraine rolled down her window. The taller officer leaned in, his eyes sweeping over her, the truck, and the sacks of grain tied in the back. He claimed her load was improperly secured, that the ropes were insufficient, that she was endangering others by transporting it this way. She knew it was nonsense. She had tied those knots herself, knots that had withstood storms. She offered to adjust them anyway, but the smirk from the second officer told her there would be no reasoning. Their questions multiplied. Where was she headed? Why at this hour? Did she have permits for the weight she carried? Her answers, calm and steady, were dismissed as if they were lies. The tall one gestured to the back of the truck, insisted she step out, and when she did, the handcuffs came out without hesitation. The metal bit into her wrists as if her skin were guilty by nature. She did not struggle. She did not raise her voice. She stood silently as they led her to their car, her breath even, her eyes forward. The sacks of grain stood untouched in the bed of the pickup, the ropes still taut. The road was quiet, the fields swaying gently in the evening wind, as if the earth itself bore witness to another act of injustice. When the patrol car turned toward the county precinct, Lorraine closed her eyes briefly. She had seen worse chains, heard harsher commands. This too would pass. Yet she knew that this arrest was not about ropes or grain. It was about something far deeper, something that had haunted her all her life, a system that sought to remind her she did not belong, no matter how much she gave. The precinct loomed ahead, its gray walls lit by the harsh glow of fluorescent lights. The officers led her inside, through corridors that smelled of sweat and bleach, past desks where younger men in uniform watched her with curiosity and amusement. Keys jingled, laughter flickered in the air, and then the door of the holding cell clanged shut behind her. She sat on the cold bench, folding her arms, her gaze lowering to the cracked floor. Outside, the voices of her captors rose, mocking, careless, certain they had broken another. Lorraine did not speak. Her silence filled the cell like a storm cloud gathering. Somewhere deep inside, she began to count. The land she had left behind that evening waited for her return. The cows would need feeding at dawn. The fields would need checking. The farm was her life, her duty, her reason, and she knew with the certainty of someone who had faced down both desert war zones and county prejudice that this night in a cell would not end the way her captors expected. It would be only the beginning. The clang of the bars echoed through the precinct as the lock slid into place, a sharp metallic sound that seemed to seal Lorraine Harper into a space meant not just to confine her body, but to diminish her spirit. The cell was narrow, no more than a few steps from wall to wall, with a single steel bench bolted to the concrete and a flickering fluorescent light that hummed above her. The air smelled faintly of bleach and sweat, stale and suffocating. Lorraine lowered herself onto the bench, her wrists still aching from the too tight cuffs, and folded her arms across her chest. She did not lift her eyes to meet the officers who lingered outside the bars. Instead, she let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. The precinct itself was alive with a kind of restless energy. Phones rang in distant rooms, boots scuffed against linoleum floors, and the low rumble of men's voices carried through the halls. Yet here, in the small holding block, the sound was sharper, more cruel. The two officers who had dragged her and Thomas Crane and Andrew Miller hovered like vultures who had found prey to pick apart. They spoke not to enforce law, but to enjoy power, their words dripping with contempt as if she were an object for their amusement. Thomas leaned against the bars, his tall frame blocking part of the dim light, his face shadowed into something harsher than it already was. His jaw was set in a permanent scowl, his eyes cold and assessing, as though searching for cracks in her composure. Andrew stood beside him with that same smirk he had worn on the roadside, twirling the keys to the cell around his finger as though it were a trophy. Behind them, a pair of younger officers lounged against the wall, observing the scene like spectators at a show. There was no question of intervention, no flicker of doubt in their eyes about whether this was right. To them it was routine, even entertainment. A black woman in a cell, stripped of her dignity, while the men with badges ridiculed her. Their words spilled into the air with practiced venom. They mocked her farm, calling it dirt and dust, pretending to pity her for clinging to land that would never make her equal in their eyes. They told her she was nothing without their permission, that she ought to remember her place. Every phrase was designed to grind her down, to provoke a reaction, to pull a spark of anger or fear from her lips so they could feel superior when she broke. Yet she did not rise to it. She sat still, her gaze lowered, her body calm. Inside her chest, however, her heart beat steadily, each pulse a reminder of the discipline drilled into her years ago. She thought of deserts where she had crouched behind armored vehicles, of nights when silence meant survival, of missions where patience outlasted chaos. Those memories were not distant relics, but living strength inside her. They whispered to her now, urging her to hold steady, to endure. The officers thought her silence weakness, but silence was her shield, and she wielded it like a weapon. Minutes bled into one another, and the tension began to shift. What had started as their show of dominance gradually twisted into something else. The younger officers' laughter grew thinner, less confident, as they noticed her refusal to break. Andrew's smirk faltered now and then, his twirling of the keys becoming a little too forced. Thomas, who prided himself on intimidation, felt irritation flicker in his chest at the calmness radiating from her. He leaned closer to the bars, jabbing at the air with his finger as though to puncture her composure. But her face remained still, her eyes sharp when they finally lifted to meet his. That look unsettled him. It was not defiance, not anger, it was patience, controlled and precise, as though she were waiting for something inevitable. The realization gnawed at him that perhaps he was not the one in control after all. He barked at her, demanding a response, insisting she acknowledge him, but the words landed on her like pebbles thrown at a mountain. Andrew tried humor, whispering conspiratorially, telling her that women like her always cracked, that she was fooling herself if she thought otherwise. Lorraine offered nothing in return. In the silence, Lorraine began to count, one breath, then another, the seconds sliding by with the rhythm of the old clock on the far wall. She could almost hear its ticking, louder than the jeers of the men before her. Tick, tock. Each sound reminded her of convoys timed to the second, of waiting for orders to move through hostile terrain, of lives depending on patience. She knew what her captors could not, that her time in the cell was temporary, that strength was measured not in who shouted loudest, but in who endured longest. The memory of her farm clung to her even here. She imagined the cows in the pasture, the crops standing tall in rows, the smell of earth after rain. That land was waiting for her return, and she would not betray it by crumbling under the weight of small men in uniform. They did not know who she was or what she had lived through. To them, she was only another black woman with dirt on her boots, someone to be bent to their will. But Lorraine understood something they never would. Identity was not defined by bars or chains. It was carved into her by service, sacrifice, and the relentless work of hands that built and preserved. Outside the cell, the laughter began to fade, replaced by uneasy glances among the younger officers. Andrew whispered that she was bluffing, that her composure meant nothing, but the unease in his voice betrayed him. Thomas paced, tapping his nightstick against the bars as though trying to rattle her, but the sound only echoed back, hollow and powerless. Lorraine remained still, Her eyes closed now, breathing steady. To anyone else, it might have looked like surrender. In truth, she was preparing, bracing herself as though for the first rumble of engines that would shatter the quiet. Her silence spread through the room like a shadow, turning what should have been an easy night for the officers into something heavier, more uncertain. They could not name the feeling gnawing at them, but they sensed it, that the woman in the cell was not broken, that perhaps they had trapped themselves with her and not the other way around. The minutes ticked closer to a breaking point, and Lorraine, with her eyes closed, continued to count. She knew the rhythm of discipline, the patience of soldiers, the certainty of those who never abandoned their own. She had called on that network before, and she knew she was not alone now. They thought her silence was empty. They could not see that silence, when filled with memory and resolve, could be the loudest sound in the world. She sat quietly waiting, the hum of the fluorescent light above her, blending with the slow, deliberate ticking of the clock. The officers outside shifted, restless, their arrogance slowly eroding under the weight of her calm. Lorraine's breathing deepened. The farm was waiting. Justice was waiting. And the night was not nearly over. The silence in the precinct had grown unnerving by the time the hour edged closer to night. The younger officers who had once laughed from the sidelines now leaned against the walls with folded arms, restless but unwilling to admit what they felt. Lorraine remained on the cold bench, her breathing steady, her arms still folded across her chest. Her eyes stayed closed most of the time, but when they opened, their sharpness unsettled the men who watched her. Thomas Crane had stopped pacing, though his nightstick still tapped occasionally against his thigh in frustrated bursts. Andrew Miller's smirk had faded almost entirely, replaced by the nervous chewing of his lip as he fiddled with the ring of keys in his hand. What had begun as a simple exercise of authority was slipping into something none of them had expected, and the room seemed to recognize that change before the men admitted it to themselves. Then came the first sound, low, distant, and easily mistaken for thunder rolling across the plains. But it did not fade. It grew louder, steadier, pulsing in rhythm like a drum beat carried on the wind. It was the growl of engines, heavy and deliberate, drawing closer with every second. The younger officers frowned, their heads turning toward the windows that faced the parking lot. The laughter that had once filled the precinct had long since drained away, but now even casual chatter was replaced by silence, broken only by the humming fluorescent lights and the muffled roar building outside. Lorraine opened her eyes at last, not quickly or with any outward display, but with the calmness of someone who had been expecting exactly this. The roar split into multiple voices as headlights swept across the lot, followed by the slam of car doors and the pounding of boots on pavement. Not the lazy shuffle of officers returning from patrol, but the sharp, disciplined rhythm of men and women who moved with purpose. Orders were barked, short and clipped, carrying authority in every syllable. The building itself seemed to vibrate under the collective presence of those gathering outside. Thomas glanced toward Andrew, confusion etched across his face, but the other officer only shrugged, his fingers still nervously twirling the keys. The younger men exchanged glances, their earlier amusement now nowhere to be found. Lorraine shifted on the bench, rolling her shoulders back and straightening her spine. She looked nothing like the quiet, broken prisoner they had hoped to see. Instead, she stood and approached the bars with slow, deliberate steps. Her eyes locked on Thomas, and for a moment, his throat tightened under her gaze. She did not need to speak. The growing sound outside spoke for her. The doors to the precinct rattled before they were pulled open with a force that silenced every remaining murmur inside. Figures streamed in, not police, not bureaucrats, but men and women with the posture of those who had once marched in formation, who had once carried weight greater than themselves. They were not clad in crisp uniforms, but in the simple clothes of farmers, mechanics, and laborers. Yet there was no mistaking their bearing. Veterans, Lorraine's people, her former comrades who had once shared the dust and fire of distant lands, men and women who now worked soil and machines, but whose discipline had never left them. They moved like a unit, organized and deliberate, filling the lobby of the precinct in seconds. Their presence was overwhelming not because of shouting or violence, but because of the unshakable calm that radiated from them. They knew why they were here, and they knew what needed to be done. The air shifted, heavy with the kind of authority that came not from badges pinned on shirts, but from lives risked in service. At their front stood a man whose broad shoulders and steady gaze commanded attention without effort. His name was Samuel Reed, a veteran of campaigns Lorraine remembered all too well, a man who had once overseen convoys through dangerous territory with a steadiness that saved lives. Now he was older, his hair streaked with gray, his hands scarred from years of farm labor, but the weight of leadership had not left him. He scanned the room quickly, his eyes passing over the bewildered officers before landing on the cell where Lorraine stood. Recognition flickered in his gaze, not of surprise but of affirmation. She had called, and he had answered. The precinct, once a place where Thomas and Andrew strutted with unchecked arrogance, was now subdued. The younger officers pressed themselves against the walls, no longer spectators but witnesses to a reversal they could not comprehend. Thomas stepped forward, his voice raised, though the crack in it betrayed him. He demanded explanations, shouted that this was unlawful, insisted that they were the law in this building. Samuel Reed did not acknowledge him. His focus remained on Lorraine. Keys no longer twirled in Andrew's hand. They trembled. His eyes darted between the veterans and the woman in the cell, as though realizing too late that the smirk he had carried so long had no place here. Lorraine's silence had unnerved him before, but now her composure in the face of this overwhelming arrival struck him harder than any words could. She stepped forward, her hands curling around the bars, her head held high. For the first time that night, she looked less like a prisoner and more like the leader she had once been. The veterans spread through the room. Some gathered documents from desks. Others surveyed walls, noting cameras, evidence, records. They moved not with chaos, but with precision, each step measured, each action purposeful. They were not there for spectacle. They were there for truth. They knew the patterns of corruption that had long stained this precinct, and they had come prepared with files, witness accounts, and evidence gathered quietly over months. Lorraine's arrest was not just an offense against her. It was the final insult in a string of injustices that demanded reckoning. Thomas tried again to assert authority, but his words fell flat. None of the veterans so much as glanced at him. One of them, a woman with close-cropped hair and arms muscled from years of farming, brushed past him as if he were no more than furniture in her way. The message was clear. His badge held no weight in the presence of those who had lived by a different code of honor. The key ring slipped from Andrew's fingers and clattered to the ground. Lorraine watched without expression as Samuel bent, picked up the keys, and unlocked the cell door. The sound of the latch sliding free was not loud, yet it carried the weight of thunder in that room. The door opened, and Lorraine stepped out. She did not rush, did not look triumphant or vengeful. She walked with the dignity of someone who had always known this moment would come, her boots striking the concrete with steady rhythm. Behind her, the two officers who had mocked her now found themselves backed against the bars. In a moment that seemed almost poetic, their wrists were seized, and the same cuffs that had cut into her skin now bit into theirs. The clang of the cell door closing behind them reverberated through the precinct like a judgment passed. The young officers who had stood laughing hours earlier lowered their heads, unable to meet her eyes. Shame spread across the room, heavier than the silence that followed. Samuel turned toward Lorraine, his face solemn, his voice steady. He did not need to offer explanations. She nodded once, the kind of nod shared by people who had survived together, who understood one another without words. Around them, the veterans continued their work, gathering proof, photographing records, laying bare the evidence of systemic abuse and racial profiling that had flourished under Thomas and Andrew's reign. Lorraine stood at the center of it all, no longer the quiet figure on a steel bench, but the heart of a movement that had chosen this night to reveal itself. The cell that had been meant to break her had instead become the place where the power of those who had underestimated her shattered. She breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling with the calm of someone who had endured humiliation only to see justice walk through the door. The night outside was cool, the air carrying the scent of soil and rain on the horizon. Engines still rumbled in the lot, their headlights cutting across the walls of the precinct. Inside, the tables had turned. The balance shifted irrevocably. Lorraine's gaze swept once more across the room, lingering briefly on the flag hanging over the entrance. Its fabric stirred faintly in the draft, and for a moment it looked less like a mockery and more like a promise waiting to be redeemed. The work was not finished, but the tide had turned. Lorraine knew the night would be long, that evidence would need to be cataloged, testimonies secured, procedures followed. Yet as she stood among her own, her silence no longer weighed her down. It was the silence of a storm that had finally broken, the silence of justice unfolding step by deliberate step. And with that, she walked forward, her comrades moving beside her. The precinct no longer a place of humiliation, but the ground where the power of arrogance had crumbled in the face of endurance. The precinct was quieter by the time the night gave way to the first pale strands of dawn. The harsh fluorescent lights still hummed, but the arrogance that had once filled the building had drained into silence. Lorraine Harper stood among the veterans, her hands no longer bound, her posture unshaken. Behind the bars where she had spent long hours, Thomas Crane and Andrew Miller now sat with faces twisted in disbelief and rage, their eyes darting between one another as though they might find answers there. But there were none. The balance had shifted, and nothing they could say or do would erase the fact that the world had watched them mocked by the very system they had thought to control. Phones had been raised, recordings made, whispers spread into the currents of a town that would never be able to look at them in the same way again. When the investigation began, it was swift and thorough. Files carried from the precinct were laid bare, revealing years of misconduct, patterns of arrests that targeted black men and women under flimsy pretenses, and reports doctored to cover abuses of power. The veterans had not come blindly into the night. They had been collecting evidence quietly for months, waiting for the moment when one final injustice would expose the rot that had festered too long. Lorraine's arrest had been the spark, the insult too far, and now the fire of scrutiny swept through the department. State officials were summoned, inquiries launched, badges stripped away from more than just the two men behind bars. The name of the precinct, once spoken with casual acceptance, became a caution, a reminder of how arrogance collapses when the truth is dragged into daylight. For Lorraine, there was no taste for celebration. She had not endured that night to see men humiliated or to watch their downfall with triumph. She had lived too much life to believe in victories that came from spite. What mattered to her was freedom, the freedom to return to her farm, to walk the soil at dawn, to live without the weight of undeserved chains pressing against her wrists. She knew justice would take time, that the courts and the papers would spin the story in their own ways, but her heart was not set on headlines or courtrooms. Her strength was rooted in the land, and to the land she returned. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because the road had stretched, but because her mind lingered on the night's events. The truck rattled along familiar routes, past fields beginning to glow in the morning light, past fences she had mended and barns she had painted. The farm came into view, its red barn leaning still, its house weathered but standing, its fields whispering in the wind as though welcoming her back. She parked the truck and stepped out, breathing deeply of the soil-scented air, and for the first time in many hours, her chest loosened. Here was her place, the one she had fought to hold, the one that had waited for her through storms and droughts. The work resumed without pause. Animals needed feeding, fences needed checking, fields needed tending. Lorraine moved through the motions with practiced ease, each task anchoring her more firmly back into the rhythm of her life. She felt the ache of her wrists, but it did not slow her. The ache reminded her of endurance, of how much she could withstand. Neighbors drove past now and then, some slowing their cars to stare. She could feel their gazes, could almost hear their whispers, but she did not return them. Let them talk. Let them wonder. What had been meant as her humiliation had turned into a story carried on every tongue. And though she did not seek it, respect followed her where mockery once lingered. At night, when the sky turned black and the stars spread wide over the fields, Lorraine sat on the porch with her coffee, watching the wind stir the rows of crops. She thought of her father, who had told her long ago that the land remembers those who treat it with care. She thought of her husband, who had dreamed of the farm thriving long after they were gone. And she thought of her comrades, those who had walked with her through war and through the precinct, men and women who had answered the call when she needed them. Honor, she realized, was not something granted by courts or badges. It was lived day by day by those who stood firm in the face of injustice. The weeks that followed were filled with change. The precinct became the center of investigations, journalists visiting the town, officials speaking of reform. Thomas and Andrew's names appeared in headlines, not as defenders of order, but as abusers of power. Their fall was swift, but Lorraine paid little attention. She had no desire to follow their disgrace. Instead, she focused on her own life, her own soil, her own quiet existence. Yet the echoes of that night reached further than she expected. One afternoon, as she carried sacks of feed from the truck to the barn, a voice called softly. She turned to see a young girl standing at the edge of her driveway, no more than 14, with her hair pulled back and a notebook clutched in her hand. The girl's mother stood a few steps behind, hesitant but watching. The child's eyes were wide, filled with a mix of awe and shyness. She stepped closer, her voice trembling as she spoke. She had seen the videos, she said. She had seen the woman in the cell who stood silent while others mocked her. And she had seen the moment men and women came for her, saluted her, freed her. They had said she was a soldier, a farmer, someone who refused to be broken. The girl's voice cracked as she admitted that she wanted to be like that too. Lorraine set down the sack and walked to the girl, kneeling so their eyes were level. She studied the young face, saw both fear and hope tangled together, and felt her throat tighten. She thought of herself at that age, of how she had longed for someone to show her that strength was possible, even when the world insisted otherwise. Gently, she placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, steady and warm. She told her not with loud words, but with quiet certainty, that she could be whatever she chose, that the soil would welcome her hands if she respected it, that the world could not take from her what she carried inside. The girl's eyes brightened, and her smile bloomed as though a seed had been planted in that very moment. She turned and ran back to her mother, who gave Lorraine a nod filled with gratitude before they disappeared down the road. When Lorraine returned to the barn, she paused, her hand resting on the rough wood of the door. The weight of the night in the cell, of the humiliation she had endured, of the rescue that had come, all of it settled into something deeper now. It was no longer just about survival. It was about what her endurance meant for others, about how her silence had spoken louder than anger, about how her example could ripple into futures she might never see. The sun dipped low, casting the fields in a golden glow. Lorraine stood at the edge of her porch once more, her coffee cooling in her hands, her gaze stretching across the land. The farm was quiet, but in its quiet was strength. The humiliation of that night was behind her, but the lesson remained. Power does not live in the false security of badges or bars. Power lives in honor, in dignity, in the refusal to bow to those who would strip it away. As darkness fell, she whispered softly to herself, words not meant for anyone else, but words that carried the truth of her life. Honor lasts longer than hate. And with that, she turned back toward the house, ready for the dawn that would come, ready to walk her fields again, ready to live the life she had claimed and protected. The story of her arrest would continue to travel, would continue to inspire, would continue to remind others of what could be endured and overcome. But Lorraine Harper did not chase those echoes. She lived her life rooted in the soil of her farm, certain in the knowledge that she had walked into the precinct a prisoner and walked out a symbol. And though the world might forget, the land never would. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.